pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, To Start a War by Robert Draper. Robert is a writer at large for the New York Times Sunday magazine and a contributing writer for National Geographic. He's written several previous books, mostly on US subjects, A Look Inside the House of Representatives, an examination of the presidency of George W. Bush, and a history of Rolling Stone magazine, plus another book 4 years ago containing essays on Pope Francis and the Vatican. In To Start a War, Robert offers a fresh, devastating, and authoritative accounting of how President Bush and his administration ended up taking the United States to war in Iraq. While other authors have delved into this tragic military folly before, Robert was able to draw on hundreds of interviews and recently declassified government documents to provide what a New York Times reviewer called the most comprehensive account so far of America's road to war. I've just started reading the book, which was released only a couple of days ago. And although I'm very familiar with the history covered in it, having reported on the Pentagon at the time for the Washington Post, I'm finding Robert's narrative quite gripping, insightful, and very, very well told. Robert will be in conversation this evening with Susan Glasser, a veteran journalist now at the New Yorker, where she writes a weekly column on life in Washington. Susan served previously as a top editor at Politico, Foreign Policy, and the Washington Post, and she and her husband, Peter Baker, were the Washington Post's co-bureau chiefs in Moscow in the early 2000s. The two of them wrote Kremlin Rising and have a new book scheduled for release in late September, a biography of former Secretary of State James Baker called The Man Who Ran Washington. So Robert and Susan, the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Brad.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. I have to say, it's just a great honor to be with you tonight, and especially to be having this book launch conversation with Robert Draper, who is not only a world-class magazine journalist, but I think he's one of the foremost chroniclers of this incredible period of the George W. Bush presidency. And I just, when I heard that you were doing this book, I have to say that I welcomed it, because I feel like this is the essential question, and it remains remarkably opaque and unanswered even to this day. It is a decision to go to war in Iraq that hangs over the Bush presidency, that hangs over the Middle East, and in many ways, I think revisiting it in the middle of this disruptive Trump presidency couldn't be more timely. Not only because President Trump sees himself in effect as a disruptor of the Bush Republican Party as much as of the Obama Democratic Party, but also because it's caused many Americans who look disfavorably upon George W. Bush perhaps to reevaluate what kind of president he was, or even how to think about this tragic mistake that was the invasion of Iraq. So with not much further ado, I have to say I was watching, in fact, President Bush today at the very moving funeral of Congressman John Lewis. And a side of Bush perhaps that is not so much reflected in your book, but the side of George W. Bush that comes from the old school Republican Party of his father's time, when civil rights was something that Republicans as well, or even more so than Democrats, supported. And I noted that he received a standing ovation from a room full of largely African-American Democrats at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, who certainly did not support his invasion of Iraq, and probably had very, very bad things to say about Bush during the course of his presidency, but at least were able to come together with him, or to work with him even during that invasion on other priorities. So I guess the question is, to start off with, why did you write this book now? Why now? Does it even matter when we're facing arguably sort of a much more consequential and very different political environment than the one that caused Bush to go to war? What led you back to the subject of Bush in Iraq?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question, Susan, and Brad and Alyssa. Thank you so much for having us and hosting us here this evening. We need to be supporting local bookstores more than ever, and there's no better local bookstore for my money than Politics and Prose. This is the third time I've been gratified to be doing a Politics and Prose event, first for my Bush book, second for my House book, and so now this one. And it's especially great to be with you, Susan, on this. It's a good question because I actually watched George W. Bush today too, and we were reminded yet again by watching him give his eulogy, his tribute to Congressman Lewis, that decency matters. And I think that to put it in crass political terms, George W. Bush has benefited greatly in opposition to Donald Trump because he has shown this humane aspect to him. In fact, at the time that my Bush book came out in 2007, his approval rating was 28, and among Democrats, it was 9. Now, his approval rating among Democrats, George W. Bush's, is 52. And it is clearly because people yearn for the kind of decency and the kind of integrity that Bush exhibited that the current president does not. Decency matters, in other words, but other things matter too. Judgment matters, leadership matters. And there's a reason why I believe that the legacy of George W. Bush will be bound up inextricably with the Iraq saga, which I'll get to in a minute. But mainly, I just want to say that here we are today. I began to do this book, by the way, in the summer of 2017, and at that point, we were already, well into the Trump presidency, and we could already see, his presidential style, if that's the phraseology for it. But it couldn't have been more clear that, even as we ask the question, like, how in the hell did this happen? How did we end up with a president like this, a reality TV show host who's an utter political novice? The question practically answers itself when you hearken back to the last Republican president and to the argument Trump was making in the presidential primaries, which basically was an argument for the death of expertise. He was saying to Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush and all these others, yeah, you guys have all experience in the world, and what good has it done? What have you done for us? All you've done is send us into, among other things, these endless wars. And so it was on the backs of that he was able to do his presidency based on alternative facts, based on America first. I really think that the Trump presidency could not have been made possible but for the Iraq war. As for it's not just the magnitude of this tragic episode is so great that it deserves to be seen as central to Bush's legacy, but also, Susan, I think that it is the manner in which he made this decision is emblematic of Bush. It's emblematic of who he is and of the paradox of Bush. This guy who's actually a very intelligent man, but who could be constantly taking intellectual shortcuts, a guy who showed lots of swagger on the one hand, but could be very insecure and have a patrician side on the other, and a guy who, for all of his seeming self-confidence, surrounded himself with people who did not challenge him, but rather facilitated him. And that, unfortunately, is the narrative that we see in Iraq, which I'm happy to talk about more.
Well, first of all, let me just say to everyone, there is a link and you can buy the book right now while we're talking about it. The book is To Start a War, How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq. And there should be a link right up there, to Politics and Prose, so you can purchase it and support the store. And Robert, while we're having this conversation, I found at times that this is a book that veers not only into the psychology of George W. Bush and those of the people that surrounded him, but it's almost an exercise in like behavioral economics. The idea that what if you threw a decision and nobody came? Was there even a real process around the march to war is a question that we always had at the time. And amazingly enough, all your incredible reporting, going back and re-excavating this, I think, am I correct, that it leaves us actually with the conclusion that there was not a meaningful decision-making process, that
Right. which is ironic because, there were people like Condoleezza Rice and her deputy, Steve Hadley, who were all about process. They worshipped Brent Scowcroft, the former national security advisor for Bush 41, and attempted to model themselves after that. But there was, in fact, no discussion about the advisability of going to war, and President Bush's response to that later would be, well, that's because I knew where everybody stood. But knowing where everybody stood is not the same thing as hearing why they stood where they stood. And in fact, I don't think he knew where everyone stood. And one of the more infuriating aspects of this book is that, I went into it wondering, okay, it's been said that the Iraq episode amounted to, among other things, a mass intelligence failure. And it surely was that. And I'm happy to talk about that. It's also true, though, that on a certain level, the intelligence didn't matter to the president. I mean, all the way up until war, he was saying Saddam Hussein would like nothing so much as to hand over his weapons of mass destruction to fellow evildoers who want to destroy us and our freedoms and leave no fingerprints on it. Everything in that sentence that I've just described to you is factually inaccurate. There was no factual basis for any of that. That was an imagination run amok. It's been said 9/11 was a failure of the imagination. This was the opposite failure.
So tell me a little bit about the process of reporting this. What did you find out now that you were not able to find out when you did your first book, which was, again, much more contemporaneous with the events described?
Right.
What was the value that you saw in going back to these sources and finding new sources? And, what, if anything, surprised you in your research?
Sure. Principally, Susan, what this book benefited from that Dead Certain, my Bush book in 2007, did not, was the assistance of the intelligence community. At the time that I rolled into town as a guy from Texas to do this book on Bush, I didn't know anybody from the intelligence community. And by the time I published Dead Certain, I still didn't know anybody from there. This book, by contrast, benefited from interviews with 70 or 80 people from the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. And these, for the most part, were individuals who were constrained from talking before when I was doing my research and when Bob Woodward and others were doing their very fine books, because they were still inside. They were still in the building, as they say. But now, years later, I benefited from the insights of people who, and you know that this is true as a journalist yourself, that people who have legacies to protect are always interesting to talk to, but they're not the ones who give you the best information. It's the people in the middle tiers who watch the decision makers, who affect the decision making, who see the fallout from it, but who do not have reputations to burnish, who I found to be the best sources. And those were former case officers and former analysts. I think more than anything else, you get from this book a sense of from their point of view, how the intelligence was used, abused, mischaracterized, ignored, and of course, faulty.
Although, interestingly enough, your conclusion essentially is that in the end, it may not have mattered, that the intelligence community sort of failed Bush in trying to tailor their conclusions to an outcome that they thought was predetermined. But in the end, you kind of come down on the idea that the outcome more or less was predetermined, and that it is Bush himself who inscrutably decided to go ahead with the war.
Right. We'll never know, Susan, because no one tried, whether if anyone had taken Bush up on his offer, or his implicit offer when he said, "My mind's not made up," to come to him and say, "Okay, your mind's not made up. Well, then here, let me give you the counter. Let me give you the counter. In fact, our WMD evidence is wafer thin. In fact, our coalition is very fragile. In fact, post-war Iraq is going to be a total mess." Powell came the closest with his famous August the 5th, 2002 dinner at the White House residence with Bush, but no one else did. And you're right, though, about the intelligence not mattering. And one case in point, listeners may remember that for a point in time after 9/11, there was this belief that one of the 9/11 hijackers, Mohammed Atta, had earlier in the year met with an Iraqi intelligence official in Prague. Now, if that was true, that was a big deal. That really did indicate a meaningful operational relationship between the 9/11 attackers and Saddam Hussein. But it quickly developed that there really wasn't much substance to it, that the guy who claimed to be the eyewitness to this meeting was very, very dubious. And the CIA ultimately concluded that there really was no substance to it. Vice President Cheney, in the meantime, was insisting that there was. All of this played out in front of the president. And at no time did the president say, guys, well, can you just please sit down and explain to me who's right and who's wrong here? He didn't do that. And I have to assume it's because in the end, he had made up his own mind. I mean, he had, in fact, he did say, as my book discloses, he advised Colin Powers, he requested that Powell's speech include stuff about Saddam's connection to terror groups. And those connections were just cutting checks to the widows of Palestinian bombers, which is what our allies did in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And he was no different than them in that regard. But he had it in his head that these evildoers would confederate with each other, and the intelligence where it landed did not seem to matter.
Well, that is so striking. And, just a gripping reminder in the start of the book, actually, at how proximate in time Bush and a few of those surrounding him were to 9/11 in bringing this up. I mean, we are talking hours here, not days, not weeks, not months. And despite the very, very firm, to me, that's where actually the intelligence community was arguably stronger pushing back at the very beginning than they were later on. Like they just, to them, it seemed crazy, as I must admit, to me, even to this day, it does. And, that response to the attacks of 9/11, which were mounted by Al-Qaeda, launched from Afghanistan, would have been so immediately, without basis, connected to Iraq, again, within hours. And when the intelligence community was quite united in saying no, it was Bush himself, and you did a good job of pointing that out, that it wasn't just Paul Wolfowitz or some, sort of extreme regime change neocons who were doing this, but that it was actually the president himself, again, so close in time to 9/11.
Right. Well, so one thing you're referencing there, Susan, is that on the late evening of 9/11, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, who by this time had already seen the manifest of who the 9/11 hijackers were, who were on the planes, and that 15 of the 19 were from Saudi Arabia, should have a pretty strong sense then of who did this. Instead sends out a tasking to the Defense Intelligence Agency saying, get me everything you've got on Iraq's ties to terror groups. So he was already imagining Saddam must have had something to do with this. And within days, he sufficiently intrigued President Bush at Camp David with that proposition that the president said to Rumsfeld, start coming up with something creative and, a creative war plan. So yeah, there's that. Now the other thing that that happened around this time that my book discloses is that just about a week or so after 9/11, Saddam's right-hand man, the Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz, sent 2 letters over to a former Reagan administration official to forward to the State Department, which this guy did. And these letters said, look, I know my boss has said some terrible things about America, that you guys had it coming to you. It's just bluster. Please pay no attention to it. We want to be your allies. We want to be your allies in the war on terror. We have had assassination attempts on our life, mine and Saddam Hussein's. We want to be your friend. Now, you can say, okay, I'm not sure I believe that either, but it certainly does not sound like the kind of rhetoric of someone who immediately wants to attack us, much less that was involved in 9/11.
Well, it's just still to this day striking to me. And I have to say, maybe I'm reading into it from the Trump era, but I do feel like there's a lot of just political psychology questions that seem very relevant to some of the dilemmas we're seeing right now. So first of all, Colin Powell, among others in Bush's circle, clearly did have qualms about pursuing the path to war, about the intelligence, about the lack of process, or the way that the process was manipulated to a desired outcome, and yet did not really use that credibility built up over a career to stop it. To what extent did you come away feeling that those around George W. Bush bear responsibility as well. That those who objected but silently, the sort of, Paul Ryans of this drama, or,
Right.
who
Yeah.
Anonymous is, or John Kelly or H.R. McMaster in the Trump scenario.
Sure.
Are they
Well,
complicit?
yeah, so one of, I wish I could name this individual, but it was told to me in a manner in which I cannot. But a senior administration official said, I was never hot on the idea for war. And I was just thinking, I just like, what? You never said this to the president. You never said this to, the people who are in a position to stop it. You yourself may have been in a position to stop it. And it's true what you say about Colin Powell. I do think that it is maybe axiomatic of four-star generals that they don't get to where they are by being dissidents, and I would hesitate to lay all of what came after at the feet of the one individual who did actually speak some uncomfortable truths to the president when no one else did. Condoleezza Rice learned in the late December of 2002 that the WMD evidence basically amounted to guesstimates. And she said as much. She said to CIA officials, "You're putting the president way out on a limb there." But did she go to the president and express her concerns? No, she did not. For that matter, Donald Rumsfeld, around September or October of 2002, also had reason to feel doubts about the WMD. He commissioned his own study with the Joint Chiefs of Staff's intelligence people, and they concluded that, yeah, we don't have any evidence. These are all guesses. And Rumsfeld sent a memo to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, wow, this is big. But did he convey that to the commander in chief? No, he did not. So, it's ultimately this is the president's decision, but there were people around him who could certainly have made a difference, who simply, were derelict, frankly.
What is your conclusion about why? I mean, George W. Bush is not Donald Trump. I mean, he's not like some, fist banging. He's not going to scream at them. He wasn't a screamer, I don't think.
Oh.
He's not like ruling by fear. He's not demanding, sort of slavish displays of public loyalty. So what were they afraid of?
Right. No, I mean, it's a great question, because the paradox to Bush is that he can be very testy, be very peevish when he's given information he doesn't want to hear, but ultimately he would reward you for that. He's not like Trump, who would banish you or fire you. Yeah, so but the yet another infuriating aspect to this whole saga is that the people around him really believed that his mind was made up when it was not. And so they decided that their jobs then were to facilitate a decision that he had in fact not yet made. And so they essentially built a wartime apparatus, interagency discussions all about post-war efforts, humanitarian, crises to avert, what to do about the oil, that kind of stuff. And not one interagency committee set up to discuss the pros and cons of any of this. Same with, so you mentioned the, I think, pretty heroic efforts by the CIA to push back against all this. Saddam had something to do with 9/11 stuff, but that took a toll on them psychologically. And so by the time the argument shifted over to weapons of mass destruction, the agency's view was kind of like, okay, we can agree on that. This we can agree on. They do, and it was a kind of relief of great minds at last thinking alike, and when that really could have been the moment to say, actually, if we're gonna go to war, we had better think about this. But instead, the belief was, we surely are going to war, so let's give the president everything we've got and help him make the case.
Well, it's interesting. You cite a number of times, Bill Burns, who was eventually Deputy Secretary of State, who just came out with a very interesting memoir last year and declassified, I think, as part of it, his memo that was pretty accurate about what some of the consequences would be in the Middle East of going to war in Iraq. He talks openly in that memoir about should he have resigned or not, and was that a failure of his career that he did not do so? Would it have made a difference? And I'm surprised on some level that we haven't heard more of that. None of these other officials at more senior levels have been willing to admit to those qualms. Why do you think that is?
Well, yeah, I mean, for one thing, there has not been a culture that has demanded it. I mean, in the aftermath of what most people now consider to be a catastrophic decision, with consequences that included, 4,400 American troop deaths, probably $2 trillion spent, over 400,000 Iraqis dead, that no one's been fired from this. A lot of these people have lucrative jobs now, including in the media, and so there has not been this kind of truth and reconciliation that's been required of anyone, and it really is unfortunate. I mean, because I do think that and it was one of the reasons why I undertook to do this book. First of all, let's just be clear, for all of President Trump's claims that he was against Iraq from the start, first, we have reason not to believe that. But secondly, if a 9/11 happened on President Trump's watch, God help us. I mean, how many countries would he bomb indiscriminately? So let's not assume that he would give a targeted and prudent response.
That sound you hear is me knocking on wood.
Yes, right, exactly. I'm not sure that any lessons have really been learned. Now, the intelligence community has internalized a lot of this, and they have, if anything, we see them like caveating themselves to death now on the Taliban bounty thing. But I think that's largely due to pressure from the president. But otherwise, I don't think there has been discussion. We've seen this, frankly, with candidate Biden. I mean, what he said was, I wish I hadn't given the president the authorization to go to war. But I took him at his word that he just was using it for leverage of the weapons inspectors and basically shunting the blame onto the president. But then Senator Biden also said constantly, Saddam's a certifiable maniac. He has weapons of mass destruction. Has he undertaken reflection as to why he was so fooled? Have any of those senators? Has anybody at all? I think there are lessons to be learned. There just simply hasn't been much rigor in doing so.
Well, I guess in the end, actually, that's what I really appreciated the most, as someone who sort of lived through and experienced this on the ground, actually. At the beginning of the Iraq War, I spent several months, actually. I was pulled away from Russia and was in Kuwait, and then waiting for this war to start that everybody knew was inevitable, even when there was quote, a process still going on in Washington. I mean, it didn't take much to look at the troops who were in the desert from the United States to understand that they were going to be going somewhere, and yet they were there. And I remember so vividly one day right before the war began, going out to visit some soldiers, very young soldiers, of course, as they are in the desert. And they had on one of the bombs that they were getting ready, they had spray painted onto it essentially like, remember 9/11, remember New York City. And I remember starting to get into this sort of pointless debate with one of the young soldiers who was there, and sort of saying like, that Saddam did not commit 9/11, right? And I just thought like, oh my God, these kids, and they're like 18 years old, are here under false pretenses. And I wasn't talking about WMD. It wasn't an elevated Washington argument. It was just at the most basic level. Like, I'm standing here in the desert. I can't believe that these kids, some of them may well die, in a few weeks from now. And this is what's painted on the side of these bombs.
Yeah, I remember talking to kids who signed on to to the U.S. military after 9/11 too, and then went over to Iraq, really believing the two were connected. But it's no coincidence that they believe that, Susan. I mean, Bush's speechwriters and his campaign were very, very artful in conflating those two. They never said Saddam was involved in 9/11. They just simply talked about 9/11 and Saddam in the same breath. So it was a distinction without a difference. And an interesting thing happened. There are actually surveys that show this, that after 9/11, of course, Bush talked about Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda nearly nonstop. But after their failure to get him, and then the subject moving on to Saddam, he began to talk about Saddam far more than he ever talked about al-Qaeda, but continued to talk about terrorism in 9/11 just as much. And so the two became entangled in the collective public consciousness. And I do not have any evidence that, Michael Gerson or other speechwriters and, conspired with Condoleezza Rice to deliberately make that happen. But it's clear that was the effect. The effect was so many voters really believed what you just described soldiers believing.
Do you think there's any lessons for this present moment when we're dealing with even more explicit blizzard of untruths on a whole variety of subjects? I mean, is this the sort of, one of the original sins of, kind of propaganda and misrepresentation on the American electorate?
I think it is. I mean, there is a clear distinction to be drawn between an administration where truth was mischaracterized and an administration where truth has been wholly made up. And that is an important difference between the Bush administration and the Trump administration, but it's not hard to draw the line and see how the one prefigured the other, and that and on top of which, both of these administrations, let's put a fine point on it, Republican administrations, were also ones in which there was a big conservative echo chamber, where anyone who spoke to the contrary could be punished. And so it became, in both cases, less about truth and more about narrative. And that is something that going into, I was just curious, as someone who first had seen, wanted to know how we got to Donald Trump, and believed as a hypothesis that Iraq had something to do with it. Also, was a matter of unfinished business for me, because there were just a lot of questions I had about, could anyone have talked Bush out of this, and when did he come to this conclusion? But I really came to realize that the search for ground truth began to diminish in importance during the Bush administration, and Trump was able, in a way, to both exploit and pervert that tendency in his own administration. So, I mean, and to me, this is a crucial facet of leadership that I hope we begin to put a premium on. I understand that the predominant appetite among so many voters is just to get Trump out of the White House and restore some semblance of decency, experience, expertise, and truthfulness. But I also think that there needs to be an importance in really pursuing truth, however uncomfortable it may be, and having the courage to follow that, no matter where that leads us. I mean, it's such a sad thing that there are so many people willing to believe that wearing masks is, not going to help you, that hydroxychloroquine is what's good for you, but the Democrats would rather tank the economy than let you have that. And I think that, again, in Trump, we're seeing the apogee of all of this. But one hopes that whenever Trump is gone, that whoever succeeds him will restore some semblance of an appetite for truth, however uncomfortable it might be. I mean, it's just been heartbreaking to see how countries like Italy got hit hard on this, but they were willing to follow the science. It seemed as elemental and obvious as anything else, and they're open for business, and we're not. And it's because somewhere along the way, truth has lost its primacy.
I want to quickly do a lightning round around some of the characters that we all know and have been fascinated by in the Bush administration. But quickly first, because you brought it up, again, this through line to the Trump presidency. Until the pandemic, or maybe even during the pandemic, you would hear a number of Trump critics, often from the far left, say, well, okay, fine, he's terrible, or he's got a bad character, but it still isn't as bad, and he still hasn't done anything as bad as the war in Iraq. And this was actually a present theme, and even very explicit in the at times in the Democratic primaries, especially from the more progressive Iraq-focused wing of the party. Where do you come down on that? Do you think
I'd hate to make the Sophie's choice. Which one of these do you want to get stuck with, the coronavirus or the Iraq war? They are catastrophes of different types that have certain commonalities and certain distinctions. I mean, we're going to be living with the coronavirus, it appears, for years to come, if only in the economic sense, because as we're already seeing from the GDP numbers this morning, recovery is not around the corner. It's still nonetheless the case that that the Middle East has been reshaped, and not for the better, by our declaring war on Saddam. And you look at Iraq today, and let's face it, I mean, for years and years, everyone, including myself, was willing to believe that I don't know, maybe they'll turn the corner there. But now they have a new prime minister who was backed by the Iranian government. We have 5,200 soldiers still in Iraq. Their military base was attacked a few days ago by ISIS, and 3 of our soldiers were killed. There are anti-corruption protests. I guess it's cool that they can have protests now without getting gunned down. But I mean, this is not what we were signing on to 17 years ago.
So I'm going to get to our audience questions in just a couple of minutes. So if you have them, and again, the book is To Start a War. You can also just go ahead and click and buy it right now while you're thinking of it. But you can also go ahead and in the Q&A section of Zoom, you can go ahead and put your questions in for us. We'll get to those in just a second. Lightning round. These personalities, actually very well known, especially now in this age when the cabinet is not exactly giants. But, you know, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, Powell, Condoleezza Rice. I mean, these are figures who, you know, we've all of us spent a lot of time thinking about. Did you change your mind about any of them? Dick Cheney in particular is often portrayed as sort of the eminence, you know, sort of behind the throne, the guy who really made it happen, especially in the first term of Bush's presidency and in this crucial Iraq decision. Where did you come out on Cheney? Is he the Dark Lord?
Well, no, I think that Cheney was, all the way until August of 2002, a fairly honest actor on this, someone who, you know, had certainly held animus for Saddam going back to his days as defense secretary under Bush 41, but he did not come into the administration making it his life's mission to lead George W. Bush into where he didn't want to go, war. Bush, I was persuaded by the evidence, had a domestic agenda. He didn't want to be spending all his time hugging war widows, and Cheney respected that. But where I do think that Cheney, where history will frown on him, was his infamous speech in August of 2002 before the VFW group in Nashville, when he said, simply stated, there can be no doubt Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. That was just untrue. Everybody in the community knew it, in the intelligence community. Some of them even said, oh my God, this guy's declaring war right now. So it's, I mean, Cheney's convictions also belied the available evidence. And in that sense, he's very much like his boss.
Did you change your mind about anyone between your first Bush book and this Bush book? Like, I was wondering, maybe Condi Rice. You have a different.
Yeah, Rice, I view in a much more sympathetic light. I mean, again, she kind of is the personification of a missed opportunity, because she had such proximity to the president and could see all of the speciousness of the invasion plans, of the post-war plans, of the WMD intel. But in a way, her proximity was kind of her undoing, because it's what she valued the most, and she wasn't willing to spend her political capital and risk forfeiting that. You know, her view was, you know, she was kind of, she was a brilliant woman who nonetheless was in a lot of ways overmatched by Cheney and Rumsfeld, who were constantly bickering with Colin Powell. And here she is, this woman having to, you know, deal with these like frat boy battles between them all. But she endeavored to keep that away from the president. She didn't want him to know that things had become so disorderly, and instead sought to achieve a kind of consensus view between all of them, when a consensus view simply did not exist. And I think that was the important thing to convey to the president. Her view instead was, presidents actually don't like arguments in front of them. I interviewed, therefore, people from Bush 41, Clinton, and Obama, and they said, what? You know, our president watched arguments all the time. It's probably true that George W. Bush didn't like them. It's also probably true that he would have been willing to hear them if they were necessary.
Yeah, no, that was, I thought, a very compelling part of your book is, you know, when you sort of describe how the process, to the extent there was a process, so ill-served Bush by appearing to do, you know, it's a classic example in any organization, right? By thinking that you're serving the boss with what he or she wants, in fact, you serve them very, very poorly. And, you know, had Powell and Rumsfeld really gone to it in front of Bush, you do wonder what the outcome of that would have been. One of the things I have to say for anyone who's thinking about, you know, should you read the book, my definitive answer, having read huge piles of books about the Bush administration, including my own husband's book, which is fantastic, and I do recommend Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House. But, you know, it's not just beautifully written, but you really added new details and really given sophisticated portraits of these players that we think of as being sort of so well known to us. And I think, you know, that is valuable in and of itself, beyond just asking this very provocative question that deserves to be asked right now. So I'm going to try to get through some of these questions and you can also add some more questions to the Q&A section of this. And of course, you can click at any time to buy the book right on PMP's website, To Start a War, How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq by Robert Draper. So the first question here is a good question, although I think I know the answer to it, but I'll ask you anyways. Kendall Cowett asks, did you have any hope that Bush might speak with you for this book? And do you believe someday he might speak with you again, given your history of writing about him? Maybe my asterisk, because I think we probably know what your answer to that one is if you gave George W. Bush some truth serum, you know, would he, do you think he would tell you that he made a mistake?
No, I don't. And I think that, for one thing, I don't think he's prone to much self-inspection, although as a footnote, it's interesting to look at his paintings, which seem to signify a reach within that we've not seen in this president before. Bush and I got along very well for years and years when he and I were both in Texas, and then I interviewed him I had numerous interviews with him for my other book. He was disappointed by that book. I think he believed that that would be the book that would acquit him from his dismal approval ratings. And so he made it very clear to his former subordinates that he thought the book was unfair and he wasn't gonna cooperate. However, to his credit, or at least I'm grateful, he didn't tell anybody else there's going to be hell to pay if you do talk to him. And so I did benefit from interviews with pretty much everybody around him, even despite his deep disapproval of my previous book.
But if you could somehow inject him with the truth serum, you think he would not admit to a mistake?
No, he's been saying on the paid lecture circuit, time will tell. And I'm sure he feels a lot of grief and misgivings. He mentions in his own memoir, he wished that they hadn't put Chalabi in charge of de-Baathification and things like that, but that maybe he'd pulled the trigger too late on Donald Rumsfeld. But no, I just think that the Iraq War, he still is a hopeful man. He still believes it will turn itself around. He still believes Saddam was an evil man. And I think it's the hate that dare not speak its name. I think he will go to his grave not saying, that wow, that was a terrible mistake. I never should have done it.
Well, so here along those lines is a question from a listener named CK. He says, or she says, like Trump, W went with his gut. He knew or should have known that the intelligence was suspect, and W would have gone to war regardless. W may have a more polished facade than Trump, but he is just as dishonest and lacking in substance. Which has been more responsible for the demise of the USA's standing in the world?
Oh, well, I think actually, that's a really great question. And I hadn't really thought about it, because it's tempting to say right now that Trump is such an embarrassment to America. But I know you talk to people around the world, Susan, so do I. And I think they're appalled by Trump, but they don't feel like that, they feel like we screwed up, and we know it, and we're living with the consequences far more than anybody else is. George W. Bush was a different phenomenon, and the whole swagger, the freedom fries stuff, the America talking about its exceptionalism and throwing its weight around, and having such a tiny coalition going into Iraq, I think that it reflected very poorly in the eyes of a lot of people around the world, very poorly on America as a whole, and I think has left a pretty lasting legacy in the Middle East. It's too early to tell whether that's the case with Trump, whether Trump is a problem that just simply requires, say, a Joe Biden to fix and everything will be better. We just don't know.
Well, I think that is a very salient question. I mean, what I would say, what I hear from Europeans right now is they would say Bush made a terrible mistake in Iraq. Some of them would say we tried to stop him, he didn't listen to us. But look, the difference with Trump is that George W. Bush believed essentially in the international world order and in liberal democracy, and that Donald Trump is the first and only American president to assail the very foundations of what we would all call the West. That's and that in having done so, he's done much more and even incalculable damage. Now, again, that's how they feel in the moment. I think you're right, that time will tell. But that's definitely, I've asked that question, and they will very strongly say that the Iraq War was a screw up, but it was the kind of screw up, that we've seen
Yeah.
from the Americans.
Right.
And that George W. Bush believed in the system. He believed in allies. He believed in the sort of international order and the U.S. being a member in good standing of it. And also, they would say that Trump can't just be undone by Joe Biden coming in and rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, because their faith in America has been shaken. And if Barack Obama negotiates an Iran nuclear deal, and then Donald Trump withdraws from it, and then Joe Biden goes back in it, but then someone else comes along in 4 more years and undoes it again, that America's word is no longer solid. So again, we'll see, but I think it's a very interesting debate. So here's an interesting, more specific question.
Mhm.
Tell us more about the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon, about Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, and their influence on Bush. Why were they never held to account? And, what was it? We know that these were essentially the internal agitators in the Pentagon for war in Iraq, but were they decisive?
No, that's a great question, and the short answer is not really. No, I mean, Wolfowitz was extremely important as the person who put Iraq on the agenda when that was a very, very improbable thing. I know everybody thinks that Bush had it in for Saddam because he tried to kill his dad, but Wolfowitz is the one who made the plausible argument to the president 4 days after 9/11 that, look, this is. Saddam is a bad guy. He's probably involved in all of this, and we can do something about it. Doug Feith is a different deal, and I think where Feith, who was the Undersecretary of Policy, was important was that post-war Iraq was put in his hands, and it was, a disaster. He basically was the one who co-authored the de-Baathification plan that was handed over to Jerry Bremer when Bremer came over as head of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. And furthermore, Feith co-authored with this guy, Walt Slocum, the decision to disband the army. And Feith, by the way, defends both of those to this day. The Office of Special Plans was one of those kinds of things that people on the left really freaked out about. There's less to it than meets the eye. That was just what they called the Iraq group. They weren't it wasn't, people conflate often that and what was called the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, which was a few guys in a basement going over the intelligence, trying to find ties between Saddam and al-Qaeda. The Office of Special Plans was just basically Bill Lutey getting plans going to invade Iraq. That's all it was. It wasn't like some alternative intelligence cell.
Well, and that's interesting because that really was a kind of bright, shiny object for critics on the left who created that.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting question from another attendee, anonymous attendee. Was there any single piece of intelligence so vital to the case that if the CIA or other intelligence folks had spoken up, it might have at least delayed the invasion?
Yeah, there's one. So what I learned from Condoleezza Rice, Steve Hadley, and others were there are two pieces of evidence that seemed to be particularly persuasive, that seemed to turn Bush's head. One of them, a lot of people know about. It's about the guy al-Libi, who had been captured and basically tortured by the Egyptians, and under we learned later under torture, confessed that he had been part of this group that helped train. Basically, he talked about weapons connections between Saddam and al-Qaeda, but it turned out that all of that had happened under torture, and he recanted it. There were people in the CIA who, when it first came up, said, this does not smell right, but it smelled pretty potent to Bush. The other one, less talked about, was that in the spring of 2002, it came to the president that Saddam's procurement agent for the Iraqi army had purchased mapping software of US cities to use with their unmanned aerial vehicles. So this was the first evidence that, holy crap, Saddam is going to attack the American homeland. He's looking at cities to attack. And that really, I heard over and over that really freaked Bush out. There was an innocuous explanation for it, and a lot of you people can appreciate it, which is that they had these like satellites in Iraq, these unmanned aerial vehicles. They were doing domestic reconnaissance. They needed new hardware, Garmin hardware. They purchased it in Australia. The hardware came with software. They figured the software would, or the hardware wouldn't work without that software. The software included all these cities or maps of cities all over the world, including American cities, and that's why they bought it. And so that was never briefed to the president. By the time the CIA learned that was untrue, it was late September of 2002. There was plenty of time to brief him on it, but instead the analysts who came back from Australia with that were told by the top people at the CIA, we can't talk to the president about it. It's going to look like we're flip-flopping.
History is made of such stuff, I guess. It's incredible. So here's another question that's interesting to me. As you research the book, how did you determine who was telling you what really happened at the time versus telling you what would clean up their image, given the failure of the war?
Of course, that is, first of all, let's just establish that that's what journalists have to do for a living all the time, that we always have to consider the source. And I'd say that you have to be particularly wary of that when it comes to the principals, the people who are in the headlines, the people who've taken flack, whether it's Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, or Donald Rumsfeld, or George Tenet, the director of the CIA. I found that the people who, again, were the most reliable were people in the middle tiers who didn't really have a dog in the hunt. But who often had documents to back up what they said. I very rarely single sourced things in the book. You always try to avoid that. There were some cases where that was impossible. But one thing, and Susan, you know this very well too, is that more often than not, no one is always telling the whole truth. That doesn't mean they're deliberately being dishonest. Sometimes they think something's true and it's not. And no one usually is always lying. I mean, it's, there's Doug Feith I interviewed several times for the book, and people, despise Feith. But I found him actually to be fairly intellectually honest, except on 2 or 3 points where I just utterly disbelieved him and believed that the evidence proves that he was not being honest with me. But that didn't mean he was dishonest with me all the time. And the thing you have to avoid, particularly, I say this to young journalists, and I know you'll agree, Susan, is you can't just go with whatever is like a jazzy quote and not let the facts stand in the way of like your cool narrative. You do have to not fall prey to something that like really looks like a great game changer when in fact it maybe has dubious underpinnings.
Here's a specific question that's definitely relevant. It's in the book. I may have missed. Did President Bush say he wanted to avenge his father and that Saddam Hussein had said something about him? Thank you both.
Yeah, no, it's so the short answer, no. He never explicitly said, I want to avenge my father. But to the question, did he bring up the fact that he tried to kill my dad? Oh, yes, he did. He brought it up several times, and he brought it up unprovoked. And furthermore, there's an anecdote in my story that flashes forward to 2006, when then Governor Jeb Bush is with Governor Joe Manchin and a couple of other governors, and they're touring Iraq. They're in a helicopter. It's one of these kind of co-delegation trips, but it's for governors. And they're looking at the wreckage of 2006 was a bad year for Iraq. And so Governor Jeb Bush says to Governor Manchin, so, how are your people, supporting, my brother? What are they thinking about things? And Joe Manchin said, well, Jeb, they're behind him all the way when it comes to terrorism. And then he said, for this stuff, I'm not so sure, and there was a silence. And then Jeb Bush said, he tried to kill our dad. I was on that trip. I could have been killed too. And Manchin was thinking, wow, I hope that that's not the reason we went to war. So I do not think it is the reason they went to war, but I do think that that was part of the muscle memory, as it were, that George W. Bush. I mean, when he looked around, at the landscape of who the next threat was, he sure wasn't going to give Saddam Hussein the presumption of innocence, because after all, he had come after a former president.
Well, and you make a case in the book as well that even Bush himself, George W. Bush, mentioned this. Right. So Saddam might not have, but Bush did.
Yeah, yeah. No, of course, the irony is, I mean, and again, one of these just infuriating ironies in the book. I know we could have a beer contest for every time I say infuriating. Is that Bush and Saddam, very different people on most levels that count, but very alike in the one that did count, which is that they totally misunderstood each other, totally misunderstood each other's countries. They understood their own country very, very well. But Saddam really believed there's no way these guys are going to invade me. The Germans and the Russians and the French will talk them out of it. They'll have to deal with me. We'll all be allies in the war on terror. He was positive of that. And Bush, on the other hand, was, he believed the only way they could get Saddam, they could avoid a military invasion would be to pay Saddam $1 billion, which was an offer that was in fact negotiated for a while, and have him abscond off to another country. But Saddam wasn't going to leave Iraq. Iraq was the only place. He'd only been to like 2 countries in his life outside of Iraq, and only for like a day at a time. So it's neither understood, the essential language of the other. And it's, once again, I go back to like the pursuit of truth. It just did not happen this time.
Well, we probably only got time for a couple more quick questions. This one I think is an important one from listener Samira Magdessian. Forgive me if I've not pronounced that right. For once, I would like to hear someone say something about what these wars have done to the Middle East, the harm and the carnage and the total confusion these countries are in because of some crazy ideas that were hatched in the West.
Yeah, hatched in the U.S. with the strong backing of exiles who, whatever their good intentions, had not seen their native country in 40 years, Ahmed Chalabi being at the top of that list. But that's a very good point that deserves to be made, because we tend to only look at these through the prism of our own losses when, as I referenced before, I think something like at the last count, 410,000 Iraqis lost their lives in this content. And I described before what Iraq looks like now, but it's worse than that. I mean, many people were warning the Americans, and the Americans were turning a deaf ear, that Iran would be the great beneficiary of this, and Iran has indeed emerged, as much, much stronger. And no, the Middle East is quite a mess, and the notion that this was going to create a ripple effect of democracy, and for that matter, by the way, there was a belief held by Doug Feith and others that a chief beneficiary of this would be Israel. And Chalabi and others were not shy about pushing that theme. But the Israelis, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, believe, no, the number one threat for us is Iran. And that still continues to be the case.
Yeah, it's a conversation we'll still be having and are still having. So a final thought, bringing it back to today, from a listener, Anne Jablonski. She says, thank you both. I ordered Mr. Draper's book yesterday and read the Times Magazine piece with riveted attention. And if you haven't already ordered it and you've listened this long, you should definitely order it. To end a war, you can get to start a war. You can
the end of war is a better question.
Exactly. That's a different book. that also exists. You can get it right on Politics and Prose's website. She asks, she says, I'm curious whether Mr. Draper's experience interviewing individuals for this book was affected in a positive or a negative way by the current atmosphere in Washington and the quote unquote Trump factor. In other words, do you have any sense that there's a greater appetite right now for revealing old truths today, now that we're living in the era of so many lies?
Yeah, no, that's a terrific question. And it's sort of, the answer, I guess, is unprovable. Also, I would say that it's not uniform. There were some people certainly who, Paul Wolfowitz, who in a lot of ways is the dominant character other than Bush of my book. The book starts and ends with Wolfowitz, ended up being a never Trumper. He voted for Hillary Clinton, was very public in doing so. And I think, a lot of the people that I did speak to are horrified by it. Although I do have to say that Condoleezza Rice, Steve Hadley, and others were helpful in the Trump transition team, and working with Dina Powell and others. And so there remains some cross-pollination between those two. I do think that more than anything else, what benefited me in people talking to me was the passage of time. And that there was so much score settling going on in 2004, 2005, 2006, and kind of a circular firing squad. Certainly, there was still defensiveness and legacy burnishing that I encountered. But for the most part, I think that a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people had really kind of settled in to a realization that this was a truth that needed to be told, that there was more profit than harm to be done in doing so. And that was kind of my hypothesis going into it, and I was gratified that it turned out to be so.
Well, Robert, I just want to congratulate you again for the book. It's a terrific read. It feels important and relevant right now. And I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts about the book with us, and thank all of those people who tuned in for listening to us, and hope that you will buy the book on Politics and Prose's website, To Start a War by Robert Draper. And I'm going to kick it back to Brad Graham, our fantastic host and impresario. So thank you both, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Well, thanks, Susan, and thank you, Robert, especially for a fascinating and instructive discussion. You know, some of this history is so painful and still so frustrating to recall, even years later. But the lessons of what went wrong in America's march to war in Iraq are so important and so worth exploring in greater depth and with fresh information and insight, as Robert has done. Again, the title of his book, as Susan has been great at constantly reminding everybody during this hour, is To Start a War. And you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that we've posted in the chat column. And thanks again to everyone who tuned in this evening. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.